How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another session of Locally Sourced. I'm Carter, host for today. Guest is Senior Director of MomsRising New Hampshire, MacKenzie Nicholson, and bring her in now. MacKenzie, how you doing?
Hey, thank you for having me. It's so good to be here. Thanks for all you do and for getting information out to everyone. We need
Oh,
as many of us as there can be.
it's nothing. I feel sort of paltry in comparison to some of the stuff everybody else does, but it's like, you gotta just kind of roll with the punches and grow as you can. So,
Yeah.
All right, cool. You are, as we just stated, with Moms Rising, and I'm just hoping to have you kind of, before we get into all of the nonsense, just give, for anybody that doesn't know what Moms Rising is, if you could just give us a quick introduction as to what the agenda and plan and action of this organization is.
Sure. Moms Rising is, if you didn't know, a national organization, but I'm very lucky that we get to have a sort of solo state up here in New Hampshire. So I'm a co-senior director of Moms Rising New Hampshire with my partner in crime, Nancy Glenn. We lovingly joke that I am the policy president and she's the grassroots governor. So I really handle the majority of our legislative and policy work while she does a lot more of our grassroots organizing work. But on a 50,000 foot level, Moms Rising is an organization, a grassroots advocacy organization focusing on making New Hampshire and our country a better place for moms to live and raise our kids here and to work and do all the things that we want to do and that will help our families survive and thrive. And in New Hampshire, that has meant that we've focused a lot of our work in the early childhood space, as well as what we lovingly call workplace justice, things like paid leave, equal pay. Other areas that we work on, maternal health. I love to work in the LGBTQIA plus advocacy space. We've been sort of dipping our toes into the education landscape, though it's like much bigger than, any one person can obviously take on. And really just thinking about ways that we can build community with moms and help them build the confidence that they need to jump in, because the most powerful tool, in my opinion, that we have in the fight is our stories and our voices. And in a state like New Hampshire, where our local representatives are supposed to be our neighbors, we must activate each other and get each other talking to one another again. And so that's what we do. We build community, we build skills, we build awareness, and we've sort of turned a corner here where we've been exploring new ways of trying to reach people. And TikTok has been one of those avenues, and meeting people like you. So our work has really blossomed over the past year, and I'm really proud of what we've done.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm glad to hear you guys are growing and moving, especially in this current climate where it feels like it's kind of difficult to actually reach people, or I think the internet has made things really feel sort of dissociated and parasocial, and it's nice when it actually functions. I mean, I'm personally always trying to think of ways to actually reach people and connect with people, even though I can't necessarily be there with them in person. Something that I find fascinating when I look at the sort of general scope of what Moms Rising does is I am a childless man and the vast majority of the policies I see you guys fighting for would benefit me directly. So it's I totally understand that the direction of the organization is centered around this particular group of people, but I think it's worth pointing out that everybody benefits from the policies you guys are trying to appeal to.
Thank you for making that point. And one thing that we say about Moms Rising is it's not just for moms, it's anybody who's ever had a mom or loved a mom or had a belly button, because exactly what you said is true. When moms thrive, we all do well. Who knew?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think about it in terms of with the workforce justice thing. It's as somebody who's I've said this on my show a bunch of times, said it on my socials a bunch of times, but I'm a union member, and there's a lot of overlap between sort of the union labor rights movement and this more family oriented movement that you guys are doing. I think it's really important to point out the way in which these are not necessarily, as much as it can come from a subjective place of identity, it's not a identity based thing. It's about a human based thing. It's about the rights and needs of people regardless of their individual identification markers.
Well said.
So you have been collecting a lot of sort of information, policy stuff about just the ongoing bills and things that are coming through the State House right now, a lot of which are incredibly abhorrent. And I mean, I've sort of picked out a couple that I'm interested in, but I'm curious, because you're so deep in this all the time, what exactly you feel like are the bills that we need to be sort of on the lookout for the most at the moment.
It's a really good question. I'll tell you that every year I keep a very scary color-coded spreadsheet of all the bills that I'm tracking, and it's never gotten smaller. It grows every year as I get more efficient, but also, as the world gets to be a bit of a different place. And New Hampshire has been a testing ground for a lot of interesting policy options recently, especially in the LGBTQIA plus space, and also in some of our, like workplace support, paid leave type policy places. So I'm currently watching over 350 bills on my watch list as I run through it here. And I tier them out depending on, how I prioritize things really comes down to, like, what are the families that I'm talking to experiencing? What are they telling me about? What are the fixes that I see that are actual fixes and not what I like to call nothing burgers? Where do we have allies? What surprises me? Where there are things that are really problematic. And so, I don't know, it's all very subjective on how I decide like what is the most important. But I think this year for me, it comes down to there's quite a few bills in this, what I call like the hate spaghetti space, that anti-LGBTQ plus anti-book world that I'm looking at. But there's also things that we're supporting, like a couple of childcare policies that have tested my policy knowledge this year and my ability to connect it to people and campaigns, because it's been hard to talk about some of these things that are really nuanced and try to make it really accessible for people. So really, there's childcare, there's a paid leave bill that I'm looking at. There's one that I just talked about yesterday on my social media that would get rid of parts of some workplace protections that we just won in Momnibus 2.0 that would make it so that a mom couldn't attend a sick appointment for her kiddo or for herself without risking losing her job, which I think is abhorrent. So I don't know. There's so many bills. And really, I'm just like, where are my colleagues covering? Where does it make sense for us to kind of fit in? Where can we cover the gaps? And I'm really proud of the coalitions and organizations that I work with who are really mindful about how we cover the most awful bills and how we are efficient, or as efficient as possible.
Yeah, I mean, you had sent me over the list, and I've been sort of thumbing over it the past couple days. I think the most wild thing to me is when I look at sort of the entirety of it, there's all of this legislation that's being put up by mostly Republican representatives that I'm seeing that are basically saying like, well, we want ideology out of our spaces. We want ideology out of school. We want it out of this, that, the other thing. But the sort of the confounding thing about it is that they are just replacing an ideology they don't like with their own ideology, and that is incredibly void of awareness of sort of history and context and what's happening, right? Like, my immediate thought is like, well, if you want to ban any notion or mention of the idea of gender identity, you are deliberately walling off an opportunity for knowledge of people. And that sort of just blows my mind a little bit. It's like it's a deliberate effort to push ignorance onto people. It's like, well, if you're a conservative person, wouldn't you want your child to learn about gender identity so that they can be a more vocal critic of it and understand it fully? Like, I mean, I realize I'm making a wild argument for conservatives when I say this, but it does sort of like elucidate an issue to me of like, the idea is to be critical of something by knowing nothing about it. You know what I mean?
Totally. The hypocrisy of a lot of the pieces of policy that I look at really irks me to my core. It's sort of that idea of local control until we don't like it.
Right.
And I'm wondering, is this BK? Can you have it your way? I don't know.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. Well put.
Yep.
So like the one that sort of initially caught my attention was House Bill 1778, where it's an act relative to prohibiting the use of personal identity ideology in public school instruction and policies. And I can actually throw that up on the screen right now. But it really like it kind of exemplified what I was getting at right now, where it's just like, this is wild. And then in contrast, you have a bill that's promoting the education of critical thinking in schools, which is it just the way in which these things run directly headlong into each other blows my mind.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing out a great, sort of issue with a lot of the policy work in New Hampshire, is that a lot of it doesn't come from the constituents, right? With the second or third largest legislature in the English-speaking world, our representatives represent about 3,500 people, or they're supposed to represent, right? That means they're supposed to be talking to their constituents. But these policies are not coming from them. They're coming from other radical right-wing think tanks and other legislatures that love to, pass along the hate from legislature to legislature. And if you look at this one, I'm kind of giggling because it mentions DEI. And I wondered, does Melissa Litchfield know that with some of the legislation that we've been looking at from 2025, this legislation would become like almost moot?
Right.
They wanted to strike DEI out of every contract, every piece of legislation that we had. So anyways, maybe they don't conflict with each other, and I'm just...
There was another bill that said, well, we want to strike any mention of the term gender identity from any legislation whatsoever, but then that would in turn mean that you cannot actually create any legislation that is against gender identity because it requires using the term to do so. Like, maybe I'm crazy, but that's just my initial thought when I see something like that,
Yep. I don't think you're crazy. I think crazier things have happened, and we should do everything we can to, build the walls that actually do legally safeguard us, because when we get into that gobbledygook of vague... And also, I was just chatting with some volunteers recently who were advocating for a specific piece of legislation, and they said, like, don't the lawyers who write this understand that that's illegal? And I said, oh, that's cute that you think there's lawyers writing this stuff and that you think they're checking to see if it's legal. Many times these pieces of policies, some are written by the people who work in the state house at the LBA, but others are written by people like me, frankly, and lawmakers, and some I bet are even now written by AI. So
yeah,
I'm not surprised at the garbage we see anymore, frankly.
No, it's getting a little preposterous. And I mean, and that's something that I think is actually worth sort of drilling down on a little bit. The idea that a lot of these legislative pushes, they come from sort of like lobbying organizations, national organizations that create policy that they want to ascribe to sort of the whole country writ large. And to get back to an earlier point that you made about sort of us being a testing ground for a lot of sort of new policies. I mean, I think the school voucher program is a really good example of this, where we've seen sort of a desire to push that nationally with the DOE, and it's like we're testing things out. And I think the reason I always want to push on this a little bit is because New Hampshire is distinctly different than a state like Oklahoma, right? People like to point to Oklahoma and talk about sort of like the failure of the way that they did their education system, right? But New Hampshire is unique in the fact that it is a New England state, and most people tend to think about New England as sort of like this blue bastion, which is false. New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, even as much as people think Vermont is an incredibly blue state, it's really not. There's a lot of conservative streaks that run through that state. They have a Republican governor, so that people always sort of think about us monolithically, and they don't realize that there's actually a lot of conservatism that is sort of like on the undercover in a lot of ways to the national purview. You'll see people like Pod Save America making jokes about the Libertarian Party in New Hampshire and talking about how crazy we are and whatever. But they don't really like acknowledge the fact that there's that the Libertarian Party and like the Free State Project have done a very good job of taking over the state legislature and sort of pushing a lot of these really like deeply ingrained conservative think tank ideologies that like, look, like that stuff has always been part of the conservative plan. And that dates back well into the 90s and goes back to Reagan. And, like this stuff has always been there. And I think there's a certain degree of denial about where this all comes from and what it actually means. Everybody thinks that like, oh, if you're a conservative, then you're just for lower taxes. And, you're just for sort of like traditional cultural norms and whatnot. And that's not really true at all. It's genuinely a movement to try and reel us back to a very old school racist way of thinking. I mean, and we have a current news item that's very indicative of that, the whole segregated schools thing, which is, that's going to lock this interview in time a little bit. But it is sort of like it's about moving the goalposts. It's about shifting that Overton window further and further to the right and doing this sort of testing in this perceivably blue space as a way of like, how much can we get away with here? Because if we can get away with it in New Hampshire, if we can get away with it in New England, then it's going to map to the whole country. That makes it a lot easier to make the argument in a place like California. So I think that's why, and not to say that New Hampshire is particularly special or anything like that, but I do think that there's value in looking at us individually as a case example for the development of making conservative policy palatable to sort of centrist Democrats, as they are trying to sort of like increase the size of their tent to include people like Liz Cheney. And that's, I'm sort of rambling here, but it's like, I want to sort of set this up and have you, as somebody who definitely knows more about this stuff than I do, respond to this idea.
I think you are onto something there because, right, one of the biggest positives for that libertarian and free state movement when they were deciding to come here was our legislature and the way that it is pretty easy to become a lawmaker here. And so they chose us on purpose. And so it's no surprise to me that it's easy to test shitty pieces of legislation here because we have so many lawmakers and because there are so many They can file bills as many as they want. Each bill gets a hearing. And New Hampshire state house districts are very red. They're very gerrymandered, but yet, like you said, our federal delegation is blue. And so it leads to this, like you said, weird public perception of us being like blue centrist. And I think it's a little bit misguided. And I think New Hampshire is changing, whether for the better or for the good, but the makeup of our state is changing because of the politics of the past decade or two, where it's no longer family friendly. And the lawmakers who want to say that it's not, and that our population statistics aren't changing, are wrong. There's been plenty of data put out there by the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy and the UNH Carsey School about, our demographics and migration of people. And like the simple, thing here is that we are getting older. People don't stay here after college. They leave. It's too expensive to live here, and we don't offer enough social supports for families. And so, in my opinion, what's sort of happening is like we are becoming more extreme, if you will, because our population is aging. A lot of educated folks who might feel differently or, feel opposed to things like education freedom accounts are moving south to places like Massachusetts, where they have a paid leave law that offers 26 weeks of paid leave just, 20 miles down the road. The answer is pretty clear for families. So I don't know. That was also a rant to your question, but it's like, no, I'm not surprised.
Go off. The flip side of that coin that I also like to sort of discuss is, again, things that I've mentioned a bunch of times here is like, I'm a carpenter by day. That's just what I do. A significant portion of the work I do is for like incredibly wealthy people that have moved here. And so there's this perception of New Hampshire as like a tax haven of sorts. So at the same time that you're sort of denigrating higher education and sort of restricting any kind of social safety net that would have protected families, that would have kept them in the state, you're eliminating job opportunities with the exception of like big weapons manufacturers like BAE, right? So there's that component where they've got direct hiring practices where they just go and they patrol UNH to try and call as many students into the sort of military industrial complex. So that's like one of the only actual ways to keep people in the state, the young people that are graduating college. There's this component of it, but then there's also the component of people that are seeing like wealthy aging people that are moving from places like Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey to try and protect the money that they have. And then their kids are likely all the way through college or whatever, and they're not interested in seeing their tax dollars increase or even go to at all education services for children that aren't in that system. And then furthermore, because we don't pay our representatives or our senators anywhere near enough of an adequate stipend to be able to dedicate time and effort into creating legislation, it effectively ices out the entire working class from being able to participate in legislation in the state. So you have to have like an incredible support system around you, or you have to be just wildly independently wealthy, making passive income off of, stock buy like payouts and whatnot, in order to actually be able to have the time to go to Concord and engage in the process. So it creates this sort of, what's the way I want to put this? Like elite
vicious
class
cycle.
That's only capable. Yeah, exactly. It's a multi-pronged effort, and that's the way that I try to explain this to people is I'm like, it's running on multiple tracks at the same time. And over decades, the conservatives have really hedged their bets in terms of how to actually enact their plan. It works on a bunch of different spaces. I mean, you mentioned gerrymandering. That's another huge component of it as well, where you're actively icing out the fact that there may very well be enough constituents that vote democratically in New Hampshire to make this a blue state, but because of gerrymandering, it's possible to do so. And then you're sort of compounding the problem further down with the rhetoric of like, oh, we're good for business, we're low tax, whatever.
Yeah.
So that it's a very robust effort that they've engaged in to get us to this point.
Yeah. I mean, let's give them credit. I don't like to give them credit where it's not due, in my opinion, but like they have been very effective. And to further, emphasize your point, they've created that tax haven, like you mentioned. They've completely demolished our state's budget and revenue system. We don't have a sales tax or an income tax here that's helping to offset any of the cost of any of our, programs. And they continue to, they say that we're good for small businesses. We cut these business taxes that don't actually impact small businesses. They only cut taxes for wealthy and these ultra corporations like, Target and Tesla and Walmart. And we lose millions of dollars in our budget revenue every year, our revenue. And then, we lose that money. We can't pay for the even basic, what they consider like adequate education costs, or we have to cut off the back of our budget $51 million from DHHS because there simply isn't enough money. And the gaslighting that they are able to do is really impressive. So we need to be better about disarming some of that.
Right. And then sort of the other thing that I find incredibly frustrating is sort of the constant rhetoric that you get from the Democratic Party about this idea of, well, we need to reach across the aisle and to work with these people and to figure this out. And like, look, if you guys haven't figured out by this point that they really do not have any interest in work, there's what they want from you is they want you to capitulate to their agenda. It's not about finding some sort of middle ground. It's about getting you to completely roll on your belly to whatever demands they have. And the opposition of it is really sort of frustrating because it feels non-existent. And again, I feel like when I look at responses that people make, they're not from the blue side of things. They're not necessarily like engaging with the right critique of the issues. They're engaging with what has been sort of like focus group tested over decades in terms of like, oh, well, we need to argue for identity and stuff like that. And this is an issue that I take in general with the Democrats writ large, is that they're still stuck in this very like Clintonian neoliberal type of or like argument space where there's just this fundamental like allergy to working class politics and sort of just the idea of speaking for people regardless of identity, but off economics. And when you play into those identity issues, you're still allowing the conservatives to control the conversation, right? I mean, I think the whole thing with the like Rep. Kristen Noble's sort of like screed in text is very interesting to me because like, look, let's take her at her word that she's talking about politically segregating schools, right? Like set aside the racial history of that term, which like we can get back to it for sure, but let's focus on the frame that they've set up for themselves right off the bat. Like that is unconstitutional on its face anyways, because you're doing it off of a religious framing, which is something that you're not allowed to do based off of the New Hampshire State Constitution. And I do not understand how restricting education opportunities or awareness is creating any kind of like expansion of knowledge. And when I read her thing about it, oh, well, they're just going to focus on social justice and they're not going to actually teach their kids math or or science or whatever. I'm like, look, like I went to public school in this state. Like I assure you, I learned plenty of math and science. And I actually had very good math and science teachers in public school. I was not indoctrinated into any of this stuff. In fact, my history classes very much so kept me in line with capitalism and imperialism, you know, like that. You weren't getting the Howards in People's History of the United States unless you took AP history, right? Like that was the only class where that book was the syllabus for the whole semester. And I didn't take AP, so I didn't get exposed to that, and I had to expose myself to Howards and much later. And so, you know, I remember when I took economics as a freshman in high school, I remember laissez-faire economics being expressed as the preferred method of understanding economics as opposed to a more socialist model. And that's like it's wild to me that we've gotten so far away from this that we actually think that public schools are indoctrinating socialism. Like quite the opposite. We are indoctrinating a very like corporatist ideology into our youth. So it's very confusing to me that we've gotten to this point, and really the only sort of logical conclusion I can make is that there's a genuine drive to fully and openly acknowledge that New Hampshire is a Christian ethno-state, like, which it kind of functionally is anyways, but they just want to go ahead and brand it that way directly so that it, again, to go back to the model idea of legislation in the state, to be able to map that onto the whole country. They're doing a great job. As much as it pains me to say it, they're doing, you know, they're very effective.
They are. And it's really frustrating as a mom because you know, kids don't have political ideologies. They don't, right? So this idea of, you know, Democratic and Republican schools, it just like, it really does kill me. One other thought, I don't know if you saw it on the watch list. It might take me a second to pull up the piece of legislation, but there's a bill in the House this year. One of my colleagues in the House just told me about it. And okay, it's House Bill 1628. The title is Requiring Schools to Provide Excused Absences for Certain Religious Instruction, Defining Released Time Courses, and Permitting Schools to Adopt Policies and Provide Credit for Released Time Courses. Folks, that's saying public schools would have to give kids credit for attending religious classes. First of all, Carter already said, hey, weren't we going to keep religion out of schools? Okay, flag there. Then, there's a whole other slew of issues that this bill brings up. So a kiddo who uses, for example, like falls under this category and does this, would maybe leave school, miss recess, lunch, two really important things, get into a vehicle that is managed by an outside company, driven to a place where they do this religious learning, and then they supposedly come back to the school and finish out the school day. And I have a lot of questions about like the time it takes to drive to said school. What happens if there's inclement weather? What happens if that child gets sick or gets hurt at this other place? Among so many other questions I have. What? Like, absolutely what in the fuck?
Yeah, it's fucking crazy. It's really fucking crazy. And then additionally, they want to it was a different one that I saw that where they want to I'm trying to remember what it was, but they basically want to say that like homeschooling, like if you're receiving voucher money, that if you're homeschooled, that's considered going to public school. And that's crazy. That's absolutely insane to me. Like,
yeah.
it just like it genuinely makes me think like, okay, like what rules do we even have anymore? Like what's like what is and maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is to get people to say like, well, why laws at all? Why even create any kind of structure? And that plays directly into this idea of small government. We want to destroy the small, like you have to, at that point, you have to go back to overarching ideology that conservatives have been speaking to for decades and decades, which is get out of my business. We don't want this. But then at the same time, it's like, you've got this weird notion of like, well, we need to, regulate AI so that it's not generating CSAM and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, so where do you guys fall on this stuff? Because like, on the one hand, you want no regulation whatsoever, but on the other hand, you acknowledge that regulation is the only mechanism by which you can control like insane, unguarded, just degradation of societal norms. So like, what is it? You know what I mean? Like, explain to me how we don't just end up with a sort of authoritarian state that's based off of this one particular ideology, arguing for the fact that we shouldn't have ideologies dictated to us. Like, it's really circular logic.
They spin. This is how they're so successful, is that they're so hypocritical that it makes people spin. And they get so far right that they're left. You know what I mean? It's like, whoa, How did we end back here? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's just, it's important to like, because I'm not like the smartest person in the world. You know what I mean? Like I've genuinely tried to explain to people like, no, like I'm still a dumbass. Like I'm still a moron.
I think that's true.
But I mean, look, like, and this gets into totally separate stuff, but it's like, I genuinely try to personally think about it in terms of like, there is no point at which I am a completed person, right? Like I'm always on a continuum of learning and exposing myself to new stuff. So I always have to stay open to the idea of like, well, like my perspective could shift, or I could learn something new that changes the way I understand things. Generally speaking, I'm fairly confident in myself, which is like not to get into like anti-manosphere perspectives or whatever, but which is again totally separate issue that I like really, really, really deeply have like a lot of anger towards, like as somebody who is like spends a lot of time around like the manly man types doing the work that I do, but also like I went to art school and like I was a theater kid when I was growing up, so like I sort of have a foot in both worlds, and the idea, to get back to it, is like there needs to be like a degree of confidence in yourself and your worldview and your understanding that you can actually expose yourself to something that you agree with or whatever and interrogate it. And then even if you have to admit that this thing that you disagree with is true, that it's like dialectical materialism. Like you have to actually like use that as a mechanism to push yourself forward and understand, sort of, not to use neoliberal terminology, but find the third way that that actually provides you the context to like genuinely incorporate something that is sort of counter to your argument into your push to sort of reclaim the space and make a genuine argument for why we actually need to be pushing forward in this particular direction. Why like a progressive ideology is actually the best position to take.
I'm letting that sink in as a person who organizes in the like what you might consider, democratic leaning policy space. We for better or worse, we overthink, right? We're critical. We spend a lot of time, like you said, message testing, polling, researching, fiddling with certain words. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if people are seeing these two separate ideologies, right? And feeling really connected and really seen in one, and then just feeling really like exposed, maybe is the right word, by another, or, vulnerable maybe. So I'm taking that in, and I'd be so curious to hear you, because this is something that even I'm guilty of being stuck in, right? Is like, I've been taught by people who have been conventionally in the space, in the Democratic leaning space, for a really long time. And so I am so curious, and I want help and guidance in trying to figure out exactly what moves us forward and gets us to maybe not collaboration, but forward momentum, and getting away from, frankly, what I see as being like the end of our demise, or the start of our demise, I should say, because where we're headed feels really dark. So I will do anything it takes, Carter. If you want to come into my campaigns and tell me how to message better, I will gladly take the advice.
Oh man, look, I'm happy to contribute when and wherever I can. Talking with people I've met through this space, there's a lot of things that I'm trying to like figure out ways to fundamentally engage with and actually do more than just like post criticism on the internet. Because like everybody can do that. That doesn't. It's the entry of the bar of entry is very low for that. But like genuinely, the way I think about this kind of stuff is like I think about it from like having to be in spaces where like I'm working. It's like my union is IATSE, so like I will build sets for movies, right? Like that's like that's the type of work I do. And when I don't do that, I go do carpentry work, and that's just like regular residential renovations and stuff like that. And I've been in both spaces. Something that I encounter very, very frequently is like you will have a bunch of like working class dudes that will say the most like racist, sexist shit. Like really, really like abhorrent stuff. And then one sentence later, they are completely like ingrained in the like, yeah, our president's a fucking idiot. And like, like my boss is a total dick. And he's not like acknowledging how much work we do while he sits in his truck and just like makes phone calls all day. And he's not showing up to the site and like all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, so there's got to be a way to sort of capture these things. And for my part of it, what I try to do is actually just exist in those spaces and try and just every day have like a small conversation with these guys where I'm entering into like degrees of humor or whatever. Granted, these days it's getting harder and harder for me to be funny in those spaces because it's just like things suck so bad that it's just drawing all of the comedic energy that I have out of my body. But genuinely, it's like, if you look at labor movements, right? If you think about the way those labor movements formed and occurred throughout the history of the country, if you're thinking about like Haymarket or whatever, right? That required genuinely embedding with the people that were doing that work. Like those old communists had to send people directly out into the shops. They said you have to genuinely betray your class in order to, like, you have to set all of this aside. You have to be willing to do it for the entire rest of your life, and you have to go into these spaces and you have to bring people in. Like they would have meetings, and meetings would basically consist of like, how many people did you draw into the organization today? How many, like what kind of things were you doing? It's like, at that point, you don't need focus groups because you are just there with the people all the time and you're having the conversations with them and you actually know where they're coming from. So you can create a much more robust, understood argument that will advocate for these people. You know what I mean? And the funny thing is that, like, even when I hear these guys say, incredibly racist or bigoted things, at the same time, they will also advocate for, like, no, don't talk to your wife like that, and it really blows my mind because it's like, there's an understanding, and then the downstream effect is like, oh, okay, well, this person is Gen X, or, we'll make a hypothetical case here. It's like, this person's Gen X. We have to think about the culture that they grew up in. Like, well, it's like, oh, they grew up on Porky's. You know what I mean? Like they're like, this is the frame of reference that they have. You know, oh, they're a millennial. Like, okay, so like they were growing up on like American Pie and like all of these things that we're still maintaining sexist, racist norms through culture that like, but to them, they don't have this like mental connection between like me saying this thing is fundamentally me being racist. It's like, no, I'm just making a joke. And like, whether we like it or not, we have to interact with the fact that that's where their headspace is. So like, they don't even necessarily see themselves as being bigoted. They just see themselves as cracking jokes because that's what their culture taught them to do. And it's like, woke scolding them isn't going to work. Focus group testing these people isn't going to work. That's none of those things are going to provide the material change you need because you're not actually like meeting them on their ground and interacting with their lived reality that helps them understand the world through their lens. And like when you actually change your frame a little bit, it doesn't necessarily mean you change your position, but you just sort of have to widen the scope of the frame. You have to go from 1080p to 4K and think about it in terms of like the actual granularity of the situation. And then simultaneously, you have to sort of be willing to like withhold the criticism for a period of time. Maybe not necessarily like you're not saying, oh, I'm going to give up, you know, advocating for like, you shouldn't say something is gay. You know what I mean? Like in a derogatory sense, right? Like, just hold on to that for a second. There will be a time where you're able to make that case to this person, but they're not even there yet, right? Like you have to be able to sort of like work in that continuum. It's not as simple as just saying like, okay, well, I'm going to explain to this person that this thing is wrong. You know what I mean? Like we shouldn't be saying suck my dick because it turns into like this notion of like, well, that's, you're using sexist power and blah, blah. It's like, look, like, I know plenty of women that use that term and they don't necessarily see things that way. And like, that's like, like if you want to have a conversation separately in a more confined bubble space about like the patriarchy and the ways in which it's seeped into our culture, like fine, that's great. But that's not, that particular conversation is not ready for the broader public yet. That needs to be, you haven't come up with a strategy to implement that sort of like sea change in people. So it's about sort of like, from at least from my perspective, and I know this makes me sound sort of like weird and centrist, but it's like I genuinely think about it as coming from like a more left position in just being realistic about where we're at. That like you have to sort of take it a step at a time and understand that like if you come out and try and just like do a full swing right off the bat, that's going to cause like a reaction physically, chemically in the person that you're trying to change, and they're going to sort of balk at it or feel attacked, and then they're going to get into a fight or flight mode and they'll get really defensive, and then they won't learn anything. And it's like something that I always try to say to people is I'm like, look, like I can see this person and they're having a struggle, they're having a problem, and I could tell them directly what they need to do in order to stop or change or whatever. But I also have to consider that like maybe I'm not the right person and maybe this isn't the right time because they don't have the relationship with me that they do with this other person, and this other person is going to use a different structure of proposing this suggestion in a way that's way more palatable to this person. Like if I'm catching them on a bad day, you know what I mean? Like that can change things. There's all of these factors that need to be considered in order to enter into it. And when people spend all their time like reading Marx or whatever, and they're not like, you know, they're like, oh, I've read Capital and now I have the keys to the universe and whatever, right? And it's like, well, yeah, okay, like you've given yourself like a good foundation for understanding sort of like the labor theory of value, but that doesn't actually give you a way to produce change in a true way because you haven't engaged with the sociological side of things yet. You haven't really like encountered sort of the Protestant work ethic concept where that's critiquing this, and you have to again go back to that sort of like dialectical materialism of understanding what it is that needs to happen in order to like confront these frictions and develop a an actual understanding of how change is fomented. A huge fucking rant from, but whatever.
I'm more grateful than ever that your audience is your audience, because I'm pretty sure you just voluntold yourself that you're going to do the community organizing work of all the like sad white males in construction, right? Or in carpentry, because I'm not the right messenger. I'm not the trusted messenger. And rightfully so, can create that knee-jerk reaction. But it does make me think, though, you're right. Like we missed the mark, because the views are so polar opposite right now, and I really do hate the term like movable middle, because each of us, right, are trying to just like grab people from that movable middle, by spewing the very polar opposite opinions, facts, I mean, whatever they are at this point, just catchphrases, talking points at the middle, hoping that someone will join us. And it's like, actually, have you tried having a conversation with those people?
Right.
I think that's really hard. It's something that comes up for me a lot in this work, is like community organizing and working with people to try to work in their communities and do some of this work has been challenging for me, because how do you willingly send someone into a situation that could create conflict or stress? And I'm certainly not an expert at this style of communication that meets people where they're at and gives them the time. It's one of my goals, right, is to always meet people where they're at and to not kind of create that huge, like you said, the knee-jerk reaction. But for people who are just like everyday people, just out there doing one action at a time, trying to, make their community a little bit better, like saying that one thing to that guy on their Facebook group, it like sends them into flight or fight mode, because folks are so tense right now. And so all that to say that like community organizing is hard, and finding that trusted messenger is really important. And I'm not definitely perfect at this, so I'd be happy to hear you out and hear more of the ways that you make this work. I'm certainly not going to be speaking to any of these men, but I'll let you do it.
Well, yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, like, look, like I try to think about it in terms like to sort of lay out another concept here. People think about they think about left, right, center, right? And that puts things on this weird sort of like black and white spectrum. And I've personally found that people's conception of issues is far more schizophrenic than that. Where you'll have like the best way to think about it in my the best analogy I can give is sort of like you got to think about it more like a color wheel, or you got to think about it like sort of like a Pokemon stat distribution thing, like where it's like you have to consider that like there's like center as we describe it is sort of this great illusion, right? That people consider centrism within the context of like how much your contradictory views balance each other out, and it doesn't operate that way. So it's like, okay, like I have to acknowledge that I'm actually working with a whole bunch of people that are very economically left-wing, but socially right. And then it becomes like, okay, well, how do I make a case to them that they have to move away from the more socially right-wing positions in order to achieve the economically left-wing positions that they want? So like an example I give is the notion of immigrants, right? We have, like why immigration is good. Immigration is good because it increases your available workforce, like the actual working class. But it's bad if you don't create a way for those workers to enter into the same competitive spaces that, like, say, a native-born unionized working class person does, right? So there should be a serious push on the part of unions to find a way to bring these immigrants into the unions, which will increase the base of union membership, which then allows for greater power when negotiating with capital. And in order to do that, you have to not be so bigoted when you're working with these people. You have to actually identify that, like, oh, this immigrant is a person just like me. You know what I mean? And like, although we may have cultural differences and we can have that sort of debate and friction within our space, we have to remember sort of the great equalizer that we all have to go to work. And we all need to make money. And what we choose to do with that money afterwards is sort of like our own prerogative. That's where the individualism comes in. But there needs to be an individual understanding, like that personal level of things that identifies like, okay, like I have to sit with this discomfort, right? Like, and that's something that I think like people hear this and they'll think like, oh, he's punching left. And that's not really like, I don't look at it that way. I think about it more in terms of like, I want my side to do better. Like I want to win. And in order to do that, it requires like being able to hold uncomfortable truths and actually interact with them. And that's something that I think like sort of like the whole like woke culture thing really like pulled us away from, is being able to hold the discomfort and still stay in the conversation and like check your own fight or flight response. That like hearing someone say something incredibly bigoted, all of a sudden like, you know, like now both parties are in this sort of combative space where they're working purely off of the rush of adrenaline that's going to their brain, and they're no longer able to use like their full cognitive capabilities to process what's happening. And so like a lot of times what I think is I'm like, look, like the, you know, subjectively speaking, the amount of times I'm like standing there having conversations with these dudes and they'll say things that like make my blood boil. And I have to like hold that in, because I know that if I start like reacting to that, then that's going to get me written off immediately. And if I actually want to create change, I have to like show a degree of strength and sort of humor in my ability to push back, where I'm like, I'm resisting them, but I'm not doing it in a way that's offensive to them. You know, it's like, no, I'm just providing like an alternate perspective. Like, the fuck you talking about? You know, and I find that in those situations, I've genuinely gotten guys to be like, yeah, I don't know, man, or like think about you. Yeah, I mean, that's true. And then the conversation stops dead. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's a good thing, because maybe that's a seed. You know what I mean? Maybe that's a seed that someone then goes and thinks about a little bit more a little bit later. But like, look, like I heard recently, you know, to sort of give an example of how wild this gets. I heard the protests that were happening at the proposed ICE facility in Merrimack, right? WMUR did some coverage of it. And I heard someone say, oh yeah, well, you know, WMUR is covering this, and like if you do that before the protest happens, then like WMUR is kind of inciting the protest, aren't they? And I'm like, homie, you need to understand that WMUR, like if that's the case, WMUR is more likely appealing to the counter protesters to go and fight against them, because you have to understand the history of Hearst, right? Like, but that's where we're at, that like people think that they're engaging in critical thinking, where like it is the most warped criticism possible that like is void of any concept of like the history that leads up to it. And like it's important for people on our side of things to be able to like actually consider these weird contradictions and warped perspectives in a way like, okay, but this is still a person that we could capture. This is a person that voted for Obama. You know what I mean? Like, this is somebody that has indeed shown support in the past. This is somebody that said like, oh yeah, I was super left wing when I was younger, and then as I got older, I started to see things differently. And it's like, okay, well, so there was a point where you understood things in this way, and now we have to figure out like, well, how do we get you back to that point? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, because you invoke their name, the Obamas, I was going to mention, I saw a TikTok this morning of Michelle Obama talking about the where women find themselves in these movements. And so, like, shout out to any women who are watching your YouTube channel right now. Because I just want to say, like, even for myself, I've been in this work for over a decade now. I was just looking through my photos the other day and found pictures of me testifying at the State House more than 12 years ago, which does make me feel a little bit icky. But
I mean,
to this
congratulations for being in it that long, though.
I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing. It might say more about my mental health than it should. But, you know, women, I don't speak for all of us. I'm speaking for myself and for what I've seen in some of my grassroots organizing is that we never feel confident, or I don't feel confident a lot of times in the arguments that I make, in the positions or opinions that I even hold myself. I question myself a lot when I'm speaking about things that I know more than the average person about. And so where that shows up for women in this movement, you know, can look a lot like doubt, and also like I'm never going to be stepping in if I'm going to be going up against this perceived bear who has the confidence beyond what he should, and I have nothing, and you know, or maybe not as much as I need to feel good about how I want to communicate with people in the movement. And so I don't have a lot more to add, just to say that, like, I often struggle to even put myself in those conversations. And so I see you out there, if that's you. And I have actually actively reached out to some colleagues, some trusted individuals recently to try to figure out how I can better emotionally regulate myself and have more confidence in the work that I do, because it's a part of the patriarchy. Women are not taught to feel confident in what they know and to feel confident in their voice and their power. And so part of undoing some of that is unlearning some of that. And so just want to mention that as the other half of the people here, or some of the half.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's thank you for saying that, because it's like, it's really important. And I mean, again, I go back to this, like, the root of it, which is like, I don't, like, in many ways, this may sound weird, but like, I don't care what people's individual identity is, in the sense that it's not that I don't care about their identity. It's more that it's what your identity isn't especially relevant to me in terms of outcomes, because I think about it in terms of people. And I think that's something that, like, a lot of millennials specifically, you know, like sitting here talking in my mid 30s, were like raised on this idea of like, oh, we're going to live in this sort of space where we no longer see color and we no longer see gender and blah, 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 blah. And like, that was that was genuinely an experience that sort of resonated with me, but I feel like we've lost the fucking plot on that really, really bad.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we don't sort of like integrate the idea that like you can hold both truths at the same time. You can say like, okay, well, like, we're all people, and at the same time we're all subject to patriarchal norms that sort of like reinforce and reify the terrible feelings that we have, that keep us acting off of our lizard brain and not out of like a much more logical space that addresses issues. So like, generally speaking, I try to approach things first as just like, we're humans, we're all humans, right? And then we want to address issues from that perspective first, knowing that there's going to be sort of a follow on where it's like, that's not going to fix everything, right? Like, you can't just say like, okay, workers' rights, and we solve this problem, and now just racism and sexism is going to be inherently fixed because we gave worker equality. It doesn't work like that. You have to still follow on with, say like, okay, we fix these things, which now allows us to actively interrogate the patriarchal norms that still remain after we fix that problem. You know, like, but the idea is you can't put the cart before the horse. You can't say leapfrog over the class issues and just jump straight into the identity issues, because you end up with this sort of weird corporatist mentality where like you've got like all these companies changing their logo to the, you know, the pride flags, and it's all just this very performative thing that can be just as easily wiped away when the power changes hands and all of a sudden, Pride Day comes and everybody's logos are still black, rosterized, whatever. And so it's like, and again, it also maintains like this idea that like, oh, it's impossible for like a woman or a gay person or a trans person to be like an imperialist ghoul. Like that's still something that can happen. You know what I mean? Like Kamala Harris was saying that we were going to have the strongest military in the world. Like, look, there's no, just because you are of a different demographic does not mean that you won't still be contained within a classist structure. And in fact, that benefits the sort of the high-end elite class to be inclusive, right? Because it allows for them to obfuscate all of these class issues even further. And that's something that it's like, and then conversely, they can sort of like double that back over onto the working class and see like, look, like we're all, uniform in our ideology, but we're this rainbow of cultures. And then the working class, a lot of which are, at least in the United States, there's a significant portion of them that are still just like regular old white guys. And they'll see that and then they'll associate the identity markers with the upper echelons that are still subjugating them. And they won't be able to tease apart the difference between the two, and they'll associate them and then all of a sudden feel that they're part and parcel with each other. And that's not, that makes things. So it's important to be able to kind of tease those things separately and address them in their appropriate moments. Like timing is everything. And being able to read the room is something that I think like a lot of people on the left just don't have the lexicon to do. It's like you spend all this time absorbing ideologies. Like, look, like I don't think Donald Trump really considers himself ideologically fascist. You know what I mean? Like, I think the dude just had a copy of Mein Kampf on his nightside table and was like, yeah, this Hitler guy has some great ideas. And he never like reached a point where it was like, oh yeah, this is my ideology in the way that somebody like Stephen Miller did. You know what I mean? Like, and it's, you have to be able to like, not you specifically, but like generally speaking, we have to be able to understand the difference of like, you can have people that have an ideology that are not like conscious of the fact that they have that ideology. And it's almost scarier when they're not conscious of it, because the second you try to engage with the ideology, they're going to get really defensive because they're like all of a sudden thrown into this space of like not understanding, right? They'll be like, well, you're attacking me personally. And, and it's like, no, I'm attacking your ideology. They're like, I'm not ideological. And it's like, okay, that's not how this plays. But like, that's part of, this is that point where we loop all the way back around. Where when you defund education and you destroy education, you destroy the ability for people to think critically and understand what an ideology even is in the first place, to understand that like we all have sort of tacit ideologies that we participate in, whether we're aware of them or not. And we may like to think that like, oh, well, I'm apolitical, I'm without this. And it's like, no, you're not. You're just not engaging in the critical thought necessary to examine that. And subsequently, you're making all of these ideologically driven assertions that you don't understand are tied to an ideology. You just think it's about being unbiased. And that's where this whole thing starts to fall apart.
That was a big loop that you just made for me, but it's such a great point. And it's like, the lack, we never think about the lack, right? We think about what is. We think about, especially when it comes to the education arguments, that they're afraid we're teaching them X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, the things that we aren't teaching them are also shaping them. It's a big part of that. Yeah.
Right. It's, which is funny to me because I think about like, the whole capitalist idea, like, oh, well, you got to look for the vacuum and you got to fill the void and all this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, so do that with your actual understanding of problems too. Like, don't look at what exists, look at the empty spaces, and then try and understand those voids in between.
All right. Well, you've convinced me.
I mean, it's just it's like I consume all this stuff and I read all these things and I'm in these environments or whatever, but then it's like I'll go and look at sort of like the activist space, and it's hard for me to shake the perception of it as a bubble unto itself, and the way in which like that bubble is self-contained. And then there's like, a lot of, I mean, I don't want to sound mean here, but there's a lot of like self-soothing mechanisms people use to try and like feel like we're making progress or we're getting somewhere. And it's like, dude, this is the trenches right now. We're on the, like, we are looking at a paramilitaristic fascist state. Like we have literally, we're at a point where white women are getting shot in the face. Like this isn't something that is like I saw an interesting point that somebody made recently where they were like, look, we're already in World War III, right? If you think about like, it wasn't like, if you think about World War I or World War II, there was no point at the beginning, like when we describe the beginning of these wars, where somebody's like, okay, well now we're in World War I or we're in World War II. It's like, no, those like the moments that those things started were only described after they had finished. And I think you could easily point to plenty of situations, like there might very well be a case for saying that like October 7th was the beginning of World War III. I think there's a, not to get too deep into foreign policy here, but like I think there's a very, very good case to be made that that was the actual beginning of what we may now come to understand as World War III, because it was sort of like the initial set off of sort of like you've got this conflict that's occurring, you've got this genocide that's occurring in Gaza and by extension the West Bank, which then trickles out to sort of the broader Israeli issue between them and Iran, which then involves the United States, which then sets off a sort of chain of events that leads to the overthrow of a sovereign nation's leader, whether dictatorial or not. We've now kidnapped the fucking dude. We brought him here, and now we're going after Greenland. And you've got China that's doing exercises around Taiwan, and you've got Russia invading Ukraine. Like, there's all of this stuff happening, and I'm like, explain to me how we are not in World War III currently. It's just this sort of weird trickled out version of it. And so, and then there's sort of the general concept of like the imperial boomerang of it coming back around and hitting the US, and the degree to which our, ICE is so IDF coded. You know what I mean? Like, so many, people forget that like the Israeli IDF has been very, very directly tied to training American police forces. So those same exact tactics are being used here as they were over there. If you look at sort of the rhetorical methods by which we're using to sort of denigrate activists and whatever, that's the same exact thing that they do in Israel. It's like all of this is sort of like, this is where we are at. And people talk about like, we're heading to this, no, we're in it, dude. Like this is where we're at. And if you change that framing a little bit, it requires you to be like, okay, well, we need to rethink how we're creating coalition. Because if we actually want to provide genuine pushback on this, then we need to really like let go of the sort of like culturally emphasized methods of captivating people's attention or emotions or whatever that we'd seen for the past decade and a half. And really think about it in a much more material way that actually motivates people to engage. So, I mean, to get back around to sort of like your context a little bit, I mean, I think that's why I'm so impressed by Moms Rising and the way that you guys approach things, because it is so fundamentally like even though it's coming from this particular identity group, the policy changes benefit everybody. Like they really do. You know what I mean? Like all of those protections, all of those movements, that's beneficial to single dudes. You know what I mean? Like if those policies were enacted, think about how many of these guys would not be incels. Like that's the only way I can look at it, as I'm just like, we wouldn't be in this situation if we were able to, like, actual safety nets that provided for. And in that instance, you then have to think about, like, okay, well, like, fuck it, I'm actually gonna send my vote to Keith Howard or Paige Boschman or Grishma Mansour or like whatever, because like enough is enough, dude. Like, we've got our entire congressional delegation, though blue in color, genuinely voting. It's like, it's something I harp on this all the fucking time. Maggie Hassan and Jeanne Shaheen are the number 2 and number 3 senators that vote in uniformity with Trump policy below John fucking Fetterman, right? Like, John Fetterman gets trolled so hard by just not even just the left-wing outlets, people like Chapo Trap House or Majority Report or whatever, right? Like, he gets trolled by actual mainstream media too. And like, we don't give even a fraction of that criticism to the New Hampshire senators. And like, why is that? You know what I mean? Like, have we ever decided to like interrogate that? Like, why does this tiny little state in New England have so much power and nobody discusses it? You know what I mean? Like, and the reality is, in the same way that everybody's like all up in arms about Graham Plattner and they're like, oh, he's got a Nazi tattoo or whatever. I'm like, yeah, but that's Maine's problem, right? Like, you guys in whatever part of the country that are upset about his tattoo or whatever, like, you're kind of irrelevant to the discussion. That's Maine's situation. Maine is the state that has to deal with that. So like, we're all just watching the show. We don't get to engage in it. Yes, you can contribute to his campaign. You can contribute to Janet Mills' campaign. Do whatever you want on that sense in terms of like providing funding, but you don't get to vote in that space. And that's really the only thing that like at the end of the day is going to decide anything. You know what I mean? Like, because if you just are able to captivate enough people, then the money stops mattering in a way. Not truly, but like, I don't know, maybe I'm sort of like spinning my own wheels here. But to get back to it, it's like, we in New Hampshire are responsible for our delegation. We are responsible for the fact that Chris Pappas and Maggie Goodlander voted to condemn the horrors of socialism, as if they're even able to describe what that is. And I don't like what was that performance? What does that do for us? You know what I mean? Well, all that does, from my view, is codify the notion that we're not going to have Medicare for all from these people. That means they will literally never support it. In which case, we are always going to be stuck in this weird, fucked up, like, private insurance system, which causes me to spend like almost half of what I pay on rent or health insurance every month, which I can't do. Like, it's preposterous. So it's like, this is the kind of stuff where I'm like, look, guys, we got to lock in. You know what I mean? Like, we have to actually get to the real fundamental situation. We also have to look at the tools that are available to us to appeal to these spaces. Like, how do you get at that person that like doesn't go out much? The person who's like so exhausted because they're on their feet all day at like Millipore Sigma or whatever, and then they get home and they have to cook their meals because they can't afford to eat out, so that's even less time that they have. You know what I mean? If they have kids, they have to spend all that. So like, at what point does that person have the time to travel across the state to go participate in a protest? Does it mean that they don't care? Probably not. But they, like, how do we get them to feel like, yeah, I need to go vote on this. I need to go participate in this thing. Like, I have to demand time out of my day on voting day, take that Tuesday and go to the polls and get in there, get it done. You know what I mean? Like, that's because this will actually provide a material change in my life.
Yep. And it's going to take all of us. One of the biggest things that I'm thinking about at the local and state level right now is drawing those conclusions for folks where, when you're not in it, people like me, like, probably don't understand or see the votes that their lawmakers take and how it might impact their lives or their communities. And school funding is one of the hugest issues our communities are facing right now. Even my town has a proposed warrant article about a tax cap that would significantly damage our school's ability to meet the needs of our kids, rise to the occasion of any emergency funding, or rather emergencies that we might experience. And so I am thinking about and continuing to think with my colleagues about how, for regular people who are going to work and not able to jump in like that, how they see the connection between the votes that their lawmakers are taking and the impact it's having. And essentially, right, the idea of this accountability work is to get them motivated to go to the polls, because it will not happen without a change in our lawmakers and the makeup of our House, our Senate, the person who sits in that governor's seat right now, our federal delegation. All of it's got to change. And it's going to take great people to also run in those seats, which is going to mean that some people have to get so pissed that they step up. And so that's kind of where I'm feeling like my lane is right now, especially with my work on TikTok, is like showing the people that connection and trying to get them fired up. It feels not great all the time that I'm communicating about things that feel like they're on fire, but it always feels like this. And I'm just putting it out there now. And it's always felt like this for me. More people just have eyes on it now. And so maybe that's a good thing. And I hope it brings some people out to the polls in March for, we've got town elections coming up. And then in November, so.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I know that, like in my town, I know we're dealing with a lot of like disputes about ADUs and sort of like the way that those get taxed, the way they get put up. People always forget that a huge part of the, not to get all abundance agenda on folks, but like a huge part of the problem with housing, for example, this idea of like front and side setbacks and the idea of maintaining traditional neighborhoods and stuff like that. Well, you have to have X amount of feet of yard before you get the road. And like, this gets like really granular. But the idea of the way funding schools is tied to property values and taxes, and the way that incentivizes the structure, it's like we need to like, at least from my perspective, like we really need to completely rethink the way we do taxing in the state. This is a hot take that always gets people super pissed off, but I'm personally an advocate for an actual income tax, and I think that's because it is the least regressive tax that we could have. You know what I mean? I would rather, not be threatened with having my rent go up and see a small percentage of my pay come out of my paycheck ahead of time. Like, I've done my best to make sure that I'm W-2. That way I have the withholding happen before I get paid as opposed to after. So that it's like if there is any kind of tax withholding, like that happens before I even see the money. You know what I mean? Like, and when you do it in that way, it makes it a lot easier to sort of digest the taxation itself, right? And then you're also looking at like a tax return. You know what I mean? Like you get money coming back to you as opposed to a bill that you have to pay. And that's like a lot. It's much better because it's based off of a percentage of what you earn, which scales. You know what I mean? Like, and obviously there are great ideas like just straight up wealth taxing, which I think would benefit us greatly. The converse of that is sort of like, if you can bring all this money in, but if you also don't have legislative body that has policy that works with the money that they have, then like it's really not going to matter how much you tax if they're just fucking misers about it and hold on to it and refuse to ignore court orders that have happened multiple times over to fund the schools, right? Like there's another shoe that's going to drop on that. People need to be aware of that just as much as they're aware of like the notion of collecting the taxes themselves. So it's, again, this just gets into like the granularity of it, the scale of it, and then the fact that you, me, anybody that's involved in this space has to figure out a way to communicate that to somebody who's like, yeah, dude, I just want to drink beer and watch a movie. Or, like, I just want to go grill. Like, I don't like, they're so like, focused on their creature comforts and their treats, and that like this is asking them to do more work. It's asking them to re-educate themselves. It's like dude, I'm in my 40s. Like I did all that. I don't want to go back to school. Like I don't want to take my free time to read legalese, you know what I mean? Like it's like it's written in English, but it feels like it's a totally different fucking language. Like it's like, and now I have to use AI to explain to me what this bill even means, and I'm burning water from another community. Like like it's just, it gets crazy. Like the compounding problem.
Before you know it, we're the characters from that movie WALL-E. Did you ever see that?
No, I did. That's like one of the only Pixar. I think that was like the Pixar movie that I stopped on. You know what I mean? Like I was like, yeah. I really should.
It's honestly like a pretty decent allegory for the world that we live in right now. But one of my kids was obsessed with this movie, and one of the main storylines is like the humans have to leave Earth because we've done such a terrible job of taking care of it that it's not habitable anymore, and there's no plant life or anything. So we all go live on a spaceship, and because we're lazy, we all start like living in these reclining chairs that recline us, and then we move around in the spaceship, and the drink comes to us and the TV comes to us, and it's like before you know it, we're there. That was a rant.
Just live our lives in a giant test tube and never experience anything physically anymore. Like
yeah.
I don't know. It's just, I was a huge sci-fi fan when I was growing up. Like I mean, even still to this day, like I'm super into sci-fi stuff, and I'm always just like so frustrated because there's all these depictions of the future and all of these possible outcomes, and we're living in like the most horrible, banal version of all of those. Like when I think about it, I'm like, so many of the things that I like would have wanted us to have come true, but they're like the boring psycho version of of what I wanted. You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
I never thought that a smartphone would be utilized to like emphasize the doom scroll and like just trap me on my couch, catatonic state where I'm just like getting AI bullshit into my brain and then just like slopifying my mind, and like sucks, dude. Like,
or the electric car that drives itself would be like, giving money to billionaires, and
right. Yeah, we're so separated from any kind of long-term goal that we had, and it's like, and not to say that sci-fi is perfect, like I just recently, I recommend this. I honestly recommend this for anybody on the left, is read or listen to the audiobook of Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. He's an interesting character, right? Like the author, because he started out as a leftist growing up, and over time became incredibly libertarian. And people may not realize this, but Grok is literally named after a Heinlein. It's from, I think the book is The Moon is a Cruel Mistress, I believe is the name of the book. But it's basically about sort of this like libertarian concept that exists, and they have this computer named Grok, and it's sort of like guiding these like libertarian moon dwellers that are sort of like at war with Earth, who's exploiting them and all that stuff. But that's a separate book. I really encourage people to expose themselves to the original story of Starship Troopers, because a lot of people know the movie, which is a satire of the book ultimately. But there's this just like it really is, the book is nothing like the film. And there is, it does such a good job of displaying this sort of weird militaristic notion of society, and the idea of like participation as like a civilian versus a citizen, and like if you want to be able to vote or you want to interact, you have to join the military. And, like they say on paper that this is how much time you're going to be in it, but really like there's a clause that can basically call you back in at any time, and so it's like, and they're using the bugs in it as like an allegory for communists, it's sort of like the perfect conception of communism because they literally have a hive mind and, but just sort of like, it's sort of a Rorschach test in a way because like, when I read it, I was significantly horrified by what was in the story. But, if you look at the actual discourses around it, like there's a lot of people that really sort of like laud the text and will use it as like oh, this is exactly what we should be doing. And here's why this is right. And blah, 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 blah. And it's like, it just like, I bring this up to say, like, we've had a lot of discussion today about like exposing yourself to the opposite side of things and trying to like stomach the contradictions and discomfort that comes with interrogating these ideas. And so that's a piece of literature that like, has informed so much of culture to this point, like the whole like Halo power suit shit, you know what I mean? Like that literally comes from Starship Troopers. There's a whole chapter that just describes these like super suits that they have. It's like that created Iron Man and like all of these different cultural sort of like touchstones that we have. And it's important to understand all these reference points because in a lot of ways, you're sort of reinterpreting things and getting further and further away from the original idea that started. It tells you what, like, where these ideas are, where they sit ideologically, and yeah, it just like it's important to have context. And like the older I've gotten, the more I've realized that like you can't just start history in the 1980s. You know what I mean? Like if you really want to understand something all the way back, a lot of times it's like you have to go all the way back to the point where it's like, okay, this culture, this society is mired in like, feudalistic, like, kings and queens type of situation. And, how did they travel out of that and what happened? You know what I mean? Subsequent to those things. It's like for anybody that like Iran is a great example, right? Like everybody kind of needs to like actually look at like the history of Iran as a country. You need to understand Mossadegh. You need to do like all of this other stuff that helps you reframe things. Like I think our friend on TikTok, Aria, is a really good, person if you want to learn more about this type of thing. He actually had some pretty good pieces about it. But in general, it's like you can't just turn your understanding of things into a vacuum. You can't just look at the past 5 years, past 10 years, or even the past 20 years. Sometimes you got to go back 100, 200 years. If you want to really like have a correct framing of things, you have to figure out where an idea actually started and how it evolved and changed and be consumed and absorbed by culture, and then how the definition changed over. Because that can help you understand why people use it will in a very cavalier way use terms that are incredibly bigoted, but then also not identify themselves as bigots, because that helps you understand how the culture shifted away from that term being used in that way. You know what I mean? Like I'm sorry, I get like really top down kind of like zoom 1,000 miles out and get a satellite view on things, but something I'm working on.
No, it's really interesting. I was sitting here thinking I recently, especially because of our friend on TikTok, David, who's been talking a lot about, how history repeats itself and that it's important to ground yourself in that context. And so I'm a documentary girl at night. That's one of the ways that I decompress, if you will. And so I've moved recently from the true crime set of documentaries to historical documentaries so that I can learn more about the Yahtzees and other, historical moments that are important to understanding the context of where we're at today. But I'm not giving up my fairy porn for that book, Carter. I'm simply not right now.
You're fine. Don't worry about it. You are more than welcome. Like, look, we gotta all
Thanks.
Indulge at some point, like
we have our lanes, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Hey, I look, admittedly, like, I'm a big video game nerd. It's like, and just recently, I realized it was like I had never played any of the Metal Gear Solids, and
Mhm.
I was like, oh, like this, people talk about it like it's one of the greatest games ever, and I started playing it. I was like, oh no, this is one of the greatest games ever, because I just had no idea that a game could be that like critical of like the global power structure. And it's like I really love like grim dark future dystopia stuff, like it's which is crazy because I'm like I shouldn't be doing this to myself, but at the same time it's like it's just I'm just fascinated by it, like, but as somebody who's like, I don't own any guns, but I sure love games with guns in them, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I was going to say, how's your Borderlands world looking over there?
I
Are you playing Borderlands?
I don't actually, but it's funny. I've actually been I really like I've been talking with Brandon LeMay and also Colin Booth about
Oh
how
yeah.
like we all have a shared passion for Helldivers 2, which is literally
Ooh.
a parody of fascism. And so it's like it's funny the extent to which these like there are so many of us that are on the left that actually enjoy consuming this kind of like weird militaristic content, you know what I mean? But I think it's partly because like at least a lot of the male friends that I have tend to understand the gap between these things, and it's like, generally speaking, I think like for men this is something that they need to really engage with, is the dichotomy and the contradiction, and being able to be comfortable with that, and know that like just because you enjoy something doesn't mean that it defines you. It's like I said, like I don't own guns. I have no intention of purchasing guns at least at this point in time. But again, like the games that I play all use guns. You know what I mean? Like, and it's a thing that I do, and it's like it's an outlet. And I think that's sort of the idea is we have to have these release valves for ourselves. You know what I mean? We have to and be able to like really engage with like, yes, like I can be fascinated with this particular mechanism or this particular hobby or what have you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm fully engaged with it. You know what I mean? It's like you can be a leftist and still like true crime. Like that's a real thing. Like you can listen to it and enjoy it and be critical of it all at once. And
Absolutely.
that's the thing that I always want to do, is like learn to sit with your discomfort. You know what I mean? Like learn to like incorporate it, because again, that's the dialectic. That's how you move yourself forward. When you look at things that you disagree with, or you look at things that you don't like or whatever, it helps you to understand them better, so you can fully like you have a better argument for why your position is what it is. You know what I mean? And then in a lot of ways it makes it easier to relate to the subjective experience of your opposition and make a better case to appeal to them of like, well, you had this experience and I had this experience. Let's sort of like cross compare them and have like a conversation where we genuinely are like open to each other, and our life experiences, and consider like how we felt and why. Understand that like the the cognitive and the spiritual aspects of things are really flip sides of the same coin. You can't just separate the two. You know what I mean? Like they do directly inform each other. And that's not an argument for saying we should have religion in schools or anything like that. But it's an argument of saying like, no, we need to like appeal to people. We need to appeal to people's lizard brains a little bit better. And we need to specify that with the people that we oppose. Because if we don't, then we have no way to make a case for them to come to our
side. Don't avoid it, folks. You heard it here first. Look
real
at
talk.
it.
Real talk.
Yep.
Well,
Yep.
this has been a really delightful conversation.
I I'm just in awe of, I've been, like I mentioned earlier, I've been in this work for a really long time. The New Hampshire politics space is lovingly incestuous, where you meet the same people over and over again, and they move between jobs, right? And not a lot of new um, ideas, or, it's hard to have new ideas when you've been so stuck in a space for so long. But the community that's been built on TikTok has helped me see that there are so many more people in New Hampshire that I couldn't see before who, want to get involved or who are involved, who are all sort of participating in that lane, their niche. And I'm really glad to know that there's someone like you sort of working on the inside of your little niche of meeting people where they are and sitting with that discomfort. And because like you said, it's going to take all of us kind of figuring out what our strengths are and in those spaces to pull people from that space over to our side. So I'm so glad to know you and just glad to know it's not only me and like 5 other people who are thinking about things like this.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's funny. I feel like I brought you on to interview you, and I feel like you've flipped the script on me. But that's okay.
That was what I had planned. So you've caught on, but it was great.
Too much skill, I tell you. Well, yeah. Thanks so much for coming on today, MacKenzie, and we'll catch up with you soon. I'm sure. I don't want people to think that this is a program where I'm only going to have somebody on. Most people that I'm having on, I fully intend on having him back. So this, I would love to continue to do like bill reviews with you for time.
Oh, I'd be happy to, because the amount of ones that come up that just need to be discussed, there are a few.
I know. We didn't even get to the book ban. Like,
I know that's okay. There's always crazy things to talk about.
Well, but this is like, I'm frustrated with myself because like as an artist, I'm so like aggravated by that one. Like, just really, really, that one pissed me off on like a guttural level. So.
Yeah, I think that's very real. I hope that there is somebody recently said to me that it was really helpful, similar to like me meeting you. It was really helpful for them to know that there were people fighting behind the scenes that they didn't realize. It gave them just like a tiny bit of hope that it's not all going to hell in a handbasket. And so just so you know, there is a coalition of organizations who come together to fight book bans, and we have our pulse on all of them. And, part of that fight is thinking about Kelly Ayotte and where she is on things like this and how she vetoed one last year. And so there's always that interesting line in politics and advocacy about like, make the policy crazier. Go ahead. Yeah. And then we'll be able to veto it and show your ass to all your constituents. So there's balance that has to be struck there, but I am as infuriated as you because I see that fight quickly going into a world that we don't want to be in, especially with the most recent one applying to more things than just books. It's like, great. So we could just start letting, flat earthers argue that our globes are offensive and,
Right. Yeah, that's exactly it. You know what I mean? Like I genuinely, I sweat like, and just sort of like it's like going to art school. I mean, we sort of get, but like going to art school, the thing that I learned when I was there, probably the top line was it's not really about what you can prove. It's about what you can subjectively argue. And it was like, for what it's worth on my end, I walked away from it thinking like, okay, like everything that I make, I have to make conceptually airtight. You know what I mean? Like I have to be able to anticipate any counter argument or any possible interpretation, because there's no, unlike in mathematics or science where you have research that you can perform, you have testing that you can do that gives you a much more concrete reference point. It is 100% subjective. And so there's always a subjective opening for somebody to come in and make a case to, undermine the art itself. And a lot of times you then spend a ton of effort reducing your piece and whatever to a point where like, I think you made this cohesive thing that's sort of inalienable and incorporates all possible arguments. You've looked at it from every single side, and then somebody comes in and just like smashes. the thing about, like for the longest time, I was like, oh, well, politics is very much so, there's a lot more concrete outcomes that you can point to. There's a lot of data that's measured that you can look at it and you can say, no, there's this. And we've actually come to a point where politics is very much so entering this, what I would consider to be much more like critical space of argument in the way that I experienced in art school. And where it's just about subjectivity, and you've got points where you can, like, you can have a conservative person go up and say something false and then just keep restating the false thing and then walk away, and you've got people who are like, they won, you know what I mean? And it's like, so we're so divorced from the baseline of data and facts articulate reality, and we've gotten into this much more argumentative, subjective, like, what even is the world? And I worry because it pushes people into this much more solipsistic understanding of the spaces that they're in, where they see another person as even real. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I'm just in a simulation. All of this is nothing. So, like, who cares if I beat the crap out of them? Like, it's,
Yeah.
and that's the part that I worry about. You know what I mean? That's why I recognize that everybody around me is like autonomous and exists in the same way that I do. And even if I disagree with them, they still like feel pain. They feel their emotions. They, like, they enjoy things, like that they are real, and this is all tangible, and have to be able to come back to truly grounded materialism or material.
Yep, I'm there with you. And also, it just makes me think that I don't know, that empathy piece. And I'll wrap up here because I can hear my kids like getting ready to head to a haircut appointment. But
Of course.
For me, the biggest thing about these book bans that is so scary, and about the sort of like fight around, segregated schools and all of that stuff, is like we are moving away from a society that teaches our kids empathy and teaches them anything beyond like those concrete, core curriculum things, critical thinking and understanding how another person can have a perspective that they have or feel differently in their bodies. And I truly believe that is like the scariest thing, because when we get to a place where, like you said, we don't consider other people, humans, we our self-conscious or our subconscious says it's okay to just harm these people, whether physically or through policy choices that we make. And I really think that the folks who disagree with us have gotten a great hold, and why they've been so successful is because they are attacking our empathy, and we are empathetic. And that feels to me like a big crux of this fight.
Yep. I couldn't agree more. What an excellent note to end on. I feel like it really distills so much of the conversation we just had. So thanks so much for joining me today, MacKenzie. This was really delightful.
Happy to.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And that's it for today, folks. Thank you so much for joining. If you enjoyed this, please consider becoming a subscriber on YouTube. If you want to support the channel, you can head over to the Patreon. Yeah, this is, we're just trying to do it, and none of this is paywalled, so anybody that wants to get it, I don't restrict you in any way, shape, or form. This is about knowledge and expanding your concept of things. So please feel free to subscribe, and we'll be here whenever you're ready. Thanks so much. Catch you next time.